The morning sun cast long shadows across Lake Harmony as Mark Thompson pulled his bass boat up to the dock. The 26-foot Ranger had been his pride and joy for 3 years now, and the small, private lake nestled between rolling hills provided the perfect escape from his demanding job as a maritime attorney. What he didn't expect was to find a bright orange towing notice plastered across his windshield. Mark peeled off the notice with growing irritation. The letterhead read, "Harmony Estates Homeowners Association," and the message was clear and threatening. His boat was in violation of community standards and would be towed within 48 hours if not removed immediately. The notice cited Section 12 of the HOA Covenant, which allegedly prohibited boats longer than 20 feet from being moored at the community dock. This was the first Mark had heard of any such restriction. He had purchased his lakefront property 18 months ago, specifically because the real estate agent had assured him that his boat ownership and docking were not only permitted but encouraged. The lake was one of the primary selling points of the entire Harmony Estates development. He had even paid an additional premium for a lot with direct lake access. Mark walked up the gravel path to his modest 2-story home and immediately pulled out his property documents. He spent the better part of the morning combing through every page of his deed and the original HOA covenant. Nowhere in any of the documents could he find any mention of boat length restrictions. The original covenant, from when the development was first established 15 years ago, contains standard language about maintaining property values and architectural guidelines, but nothing whatsoever about watercraft limitations. Frustrated and determined to get to the bottom of this apparent overreach, Mark decided to pay a visit to the current HOA president. According to the notice, the president was one Patricia Wells, who lived in the largest house on the north side of the lake. Her property was easily identifiable by the elaborate stone entrance gate and perfectly manicured landscape that looked more like a botanical garden than a residential yard. Patricia Wells answered her door with the demeanor of someone accustomed to being in charge. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and wearing what appeared to be expensive casual clothing. Her expression immediately soured when she saw Mark standing on her doorstep holding the orange notice. Before Mark could even introduce himself, Patricia launched into a lecture about community standards and property values. She explained that the HOA board had recently voted to implement new guidelines to prevent the lake from becoming what she termed a marina for oversized recreational vehicles. According to Patricia, boats longer than 20 feet created visual pollution and detracted from the serene residential atmosphere that attracted quality homeowners to Harmony Estates. Mark listened patiently before pointing out that his boat had been docked at the lake for over a year without any complaints and that he had thoroughly reviewed his property documents and found no such restrictions. Patricia waved off his concerns dismissively and informed him that the HOA board had the authority to modify community standards as needed to protect property values. She handed him a copy of what she called the revised covenant, which included the new boat restrictions along with several other previously unmentioned rules. The revised document was a masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach. In addition to boat length restrictions, it included new fees for dock usage limits on the number of guests who could access the lake and requirements for pre-approval of any watercraft modifications. Most troubling of all was a clause that gave the HOA board discretionary authority to remove any watercraft deemed unsuitable for the community aesthetic. Mark kept his composure during the meeting, but internally he was seething. As a maritime attorney, he was well-versed in property law and covenant enforcement. What Patricia and her board were attempting was legally questionable at best and potentially fraudulent at worst. Homeowners associations did have broad authority to enforce community standards, but they couldn't simply rewrite covenants after the fact without proper legal procedures and homeowner approval. That evening, Mark began researching the legal history of Harmony Estates and its HOA structure. What he discovered was even more troubling than he had initially suspected. The current HOA board had been effectively hijacked by a small group of newer residents led by Patricia Wells, who had moved to the area specifically to escape what they perceived as declining standards in their previous communities. The original homeowners, including several who had been part of the initial development, had been systematically pushed out of HOA leadership through a series of procedural manipulations. and intimidation tactics. Board meetings had been moved to inconvenient times and locations, making it difficult for working homeowners to attend. Voting procedures had been changed to favor residents with more expensive properties, effectively giving Patricia and her allies disproportionate influence over community decisions. Most concerning of all, Mark discovered that the revised covenant Patricia had shown him had never been properly ratified according to the legal requirements outlined in the original HOA charter. The changes required approval from 75% of all property owners, but the board had only obtained signatures from about 30%, mostly from newer residents who were allied with Patricia faction. Mark decided to dig deeper into the lake ownership situation itself. Lake Harmony had been created as part of the original development, but the legal status of the water rights and lake bed ownership was complex. The original developer had retained ownership of the lake itself, while granting specific usage rights to property owners through their HOA membership. When the developer went bankrupt during the economic downturn several years ago, those lake rights had been transferred to a trust pending resolution of the developer-creditor claims. This was where things became interesting from a legal standpoint. Mark research revealed that the trust holding the lake rights had been dissolved 2 years ago due to administrative neglect. The lake ownership had technically reverted to the county, which meant it was now public water subject to state and federal regulations rather than private HOA control. Mark realized that Patricia and her board were not only exceeding their legal authority by imposing new boat restrictions, but they were actually attempting to control property they didn't own. The lake that formed the centerpiece of their power grab was public water, and their HOA had no more authority to restrict its use than they would have to regulate traffic on the county highway. Armed with this information, Mark began developing a strategy that would not only protect his boat, but potentially free all the lake residents from Patricia's increasingly authoritarian rule. However, he knew that challenging an established HOA board would require careful planning and solid legal groundwork. The next morning brought another orange notice, this one even more threatening than the first. Patricia had escalated her timeline and was now demanding that Mark's boat be removed within 24 hours or face immediate towing at his expense. The notice also included additional fees for what it termed dock space violations and threatened legal action if the fees were not paid promptly. Mark decided it was time to take action. He spent the day contacting other homeowners around the lake to gauge their feelings about the HOA recent changes. What he discovered was a community divided and increasingly frustrated with Patricia's heavy-handed leadership style. Tom Rodriguez, who lived on the East Shore, had been forced to remove his fishing pier because it allegedly violated new aesthetic guidelines. The pier had been there for over a decade and was a major reason he had purchased the property. Lisa Carter had been fined repeatedly for allowing her children to use inflatable toys in the lake because they were deemed inappropriate for the community image. Most telling was his conversation with Bill Henderson, one of the original homeowners, who had helped establish the development 15 years earlier. Bill explained that the lake had always been intended as a recreational amenity for all residents, and that the original covenants had been deliberately written to be flexible and inclusive rather than restrictive. According to Bill, the problems had started when Patricia Group moved in about 3 years ago. They had initially seemed like model residents, but had quickly begun complaining about noise, pets, children playing in the lake, and what they called the declining standards of the community. Within 2 years, they had managed to gain control of the HOA board and had immediately begun implementing new restrictions. Bill had tried to oppose some of the changes, but found himself outnumbered and eventually gave up attending board meetings altogether. Several other original residents had done the same, which allowed Patricia faction to consolidate their control over community decision-making. Mark realized that he was dealing with more than just an overzealous HOA president. Patricia and her allies represented a systematic attempt to transform Harmony Estates from a family-friendly recreational community into an exclusive enclave that served their personal preferences regardless of the rights and interests of other residents. That afternoon, Mark received a phone call from Patricia herself. Her tone was icy and professional as she informed him that his failure to comply with the boat removal notice had triggered the HOA enforcement procedures. A towing company would be dispatched the following morning to remove his boat at his expense. She also mentioned that his HOA voting privileges would be suspended until all outstanding fines and fees were paid in full. Mark thanked Patricia for the call and calmly informed her that he would be happy to discuss the matter further once she could provide legal documentation proving the HOA authority to regulate the lake. When Patricia demanded to know what he meant, Mark explained that his research had revealed some interesting questions about lake ownership and HOA jurisdiction that would need to be resolved before any enforcement actions could proceed. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. After a long pause, Patricia's voice took on a noticeably sharper edge as she warned Mark that fighting the HOA would only result in additional fees and legal expenses that he would ultimately be responsible for paying. Mark replied that he looked forward to reviewing those legal expenses in court if necessary, and ended the call. That evening, Mark began preparing his counterattack. As a maritime attorney, he had handled numerous cases involving water rights, property disputes, and HOA overreach. He knew that the key to defeating Patricia's strategy was to challenge not just the specific boat restrictions, but the entire legal foundation upon which she authority rested. Mark's first step was to file a formal complaint with the county regarding the lake ownership transfer. His research had revealed that when the trust holding the lake rights had been dissolved, the county had never been properly notified. The lake had been operating in a legal gray area for over 2 years with no clear ownership structure. Mark petition to the county requested immediate clarification of the lake ownership status and argued that if the lake was indeed public water, then all current HOA restrictions on its use were invalid and unenforceable. He also requested that the county take immediate action to ensure public access to the lake pending resolution of the ownership question. Simultaneously, Mark began reaching out to other residents who had been negatively affected by Patricia's recent policy changes. He organized an informal meeting at his house to discuss their collective concerns and explore potential legal remedies. The meeting drew 12 homeowners, including several who had been part of the original development. The stories they shared painted a picture of systematic harassment and intimidation designed to force out residents who didn't fit Patricia's vision for the community. Tom Rodriguez described how he had been cited for violations that weren't even way mentioned in the original covenant. Lisa Carter explained how her children had been banned from using certain areas of the lake without any legal justification. Bill Henderson revealed that Patricia Group had been secretly meeting to plan additional restrictions that would effectively turn the lake into a private preserve for a handful of wealthy residents. Most shocking was the testimony from Janet Wilson, an elderly widow who lived alone on the South Shore. Patricia Board had been pressuring her to sell her property by imposing increasingly burdensome maintenance requirements and threatening legal action over minor infractions. Janet was on a fixed income and couldn't afford the legal fees necessary. To fight the HOA demands, Mark realized that Patricia's strategy went beyond simple power grabbing. She was systematically attempting to force out long-time residents and replace them with wealthier homeowners who would support her vision of an exclusive lakefront community. The group decided to formally challenge Patricia's authority by demanding a special meeting of all homeowners to review the recent covenant changes and board actions. Under the original HOA charter, such a meeting could be called by petition from 20% of the homeowners. With 12 households already committed, Mark was confident they could gather the necessary signatures. However, Mark also knew that Patricia would not give up her power easily. As HOA president, she controlled the meeting procedures and could potentially manipulate the process to maintain her advantage. He needed a more decisive strategy that would permanently resolve the authority question. The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching the county records, Mark discovered that the original lake development had been subject to specific environmental regulations that required ongoing monitoring and compliance reporting. The lake had been created by damming a natural creek and required periodic reviews to ensure it met state water quality and safety standards. The environmental compliance reports were supposed to be filed annually, but Mark research revealed that no reports had been submitted for the past 4 years. This violation of state environmental regulations provided grounds for immediate county intervention. Regardless of the ownership dispute, Mark filed a formal complaint with the state environmental agency requesting immediate inspection of the lake and enforcement of all applicable regulations. He also provided documentation showing that the current HOA board had been making decisions about lake management without proper environmental oversight. The response was swift and decisive. Within a week, a team of state environmental inspectors arrived at Lake Harmony to conduct a comprehensive assessment. They discovered multiple violations, including unauthorized modifications to the dam, improper waste disposal, and failure to maintain required water quality monitoring equipment. More importantly, the environmental investigation revealed that whoever held authority over the lake was required to have proper permits and certifications for water management. Patricia HOA Board had no such credentials and was therefore operating illegally regardless of their claimed ownership rights. The state issued an immediate cease and desist order, prohibiting any further modifications to the lake or restrictions on its use pending completion of a full environmental review. They also required that all current lake management decisions be suspended until proper legal authority could be established. Patricia's response was predictably angry and defensive. She called an emergency HOA board meeting and attempted to rally support for fighting the state intervention. However, her usual allies were beginning to waver as they realized the potential legal and financial liability they faced. The environmental violations carried substantial fines and could potentially result in criminal charges for willful negligence. Several board members who had supported Patricia's previous actions suddenly found themselves questioning whether the boat restrictions and other policies were worth the risk of personal legal exposure. Mark attended the emergency board meeting, along with several other concerned residents. Patricia attempted to maintain control by claiming that the environmental issues were separate from the HOA authority to regulate community standards. She argued that even if the lake ownership was unclear, the HOA still had the right to control how residents use their dock access. Mark was prepared for this argument. He presented documentation showing that the dock access rights were tied directly to the lake ownership structure. If the lake was public water, then the docks were public facilities, and the HOA had no authority to restrict their use beyond basic safety and maintenance requirements. Furthermore, Mark explained that the environmental violations had created liability for anyone who had participated in unauthorized lake management decisions. Board members who had voted for the boat restrictions could potentially be held personally responsible for any environmental damage caused by their actions. The meeting dissolved into chaos as board members began demanding legal advice and questioning whether they should resign to avoid personal liability. Patricia attempted to maintain order, but it was clear that her coalition was falling apart under the pressure of potential legal consequences. Over the following weeks, Mark continued to pressure Patricia authority from multiple angles. The county had opened its own investigation into the lake ownership transfer and was demanding that Patricia provide legal documentation supporting her claim to HOA authority over the water. The state environmental agency had expanded its investigation to include all HOA decisions related to lake management over the past 3 years. They were particularly interested in the unauthorized boat restrictions and dock usage fees, which appeared to violate public access requirements for navigable waterways. Most damaging of all, several homeowners had filed formal complaints with the State Attorney General office, alleging that Patricia Board had exceeded its legal authority and had potentially committed fraud by collecting fees and fines for services they had no right to provide. Mark Boat remained safely docked throughout this period despite Patricia's continued threats of towing action. The state's cease and desist order had specifically prohibited any enforcement actions related to lake usage pending resolution of the legal authority questions. Patricia made one final attempt to salvage her position by calling a special homeowners meeting to ratify the controversial covenant changes retroactively. She hoped that if she could obtain the required 75% approval, she could legitimize her previous actions and maintain HOA control over the lake. The meeting was scheduled for a weeknight at the community center, and Patricia sent official notices to all homeowners emphasizing the importance of attending. However, she made a critical error by failing to provide adequate notice of the specific issues that would be voted on. Under HOA law, homeowners had the right to know exactly what they were voting on at least 10 days before the meeting. Mark seized on this procedural violation to challenge the validity of any votes taken at the meeting. He also organized a counter-campaign to ensure that opponents of Patricia policies would attend in large numbers. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed with residents who had never before shown interest in HOA politics. Mark had reached out to every homeowner around the lake and had clearly explained what was at stake. The message was simple: Patricia Board was attempting to seize control of community assets they didn't own and restrict the rights that residents had purchased when they bought their properties. Patricia opened the meeting by presenting her version of recent events. She claimed that the boat restrictions and other policies were necessary to maintain property values and protect the community. Investment in the lake amenity, she argued. That a few troublemakers were attempting to undermine legitimate HOA authority for their own selfish purposes. Mark was prepared with a detailed response. He presented his research on the lake ownership issue and explained how Patricia Board had systematically exceeded their legal authority. He showed documentation of the environmental violations and the potential liability that all residents faced if Patricia continued to operate without proper permits. Most effectively, Mark presented testimony from longtime residents who described how Patricia policies had negatively affected their enjoyment of the properties they had purchased in good faith. The stories of harassment and intimidation resonated with homeowners who were beginning to realize that they could be next targets of Patricia enforcement actions. When the vote was finally taken, Patricia covenant changes were overwhelmingly rejected by more than 80% of the homeowners present. Even more significantly, a motion of no confidence in the current board passed by an even larger margin. Patricia attempted to challenge the validity of the vote by claiming that many of the attendees were not eligible to vote due to outstanding fees and fines. However, Mark was prepared with documentation showing that most of those fees had been improperly assessed and were therefore invalid. Under pressure from the homeowners and facing potential legal liability, several board members submitted their resignations effective immediately. Patricia found herself isolated and without the support necessary to maintain her position as HOA president. The final blow came a few weeks later when the county completed its investigation of the lake ownership issue. Their findings confirmed Mark's research. The lake had indeed reverted to county ownership when the trust was dissolved and was therefore public water subject to state regulation rather than private HOA control. The county issued a formal declaration that the lake was a public recreational facility and that all residents had equal access rights that could not be restricted by the HOA beyond basic safety and maintenance concerns. The boat length restrictions, dock usage fees, and other policies implemented by Patricia Board were declared null and void. Furthermore, the county demanded that the HOA refund all fees and fines collected under the invalid policies and warned that continued attempts to restrict public access could result in criminal charges for interfering with public property. Mark's victory was complete, but he wasn't finished. The experience had revealed serious flaws in the HOA governance structure that needed to be addressed to prevent future abuses of authority. Working with the newly elected board, Mark helped draft revised HOA bylaws that included stronger checks and balances on board authority. The new structure required that any significant policy changes be approved by a majority of all homeowners, rather than just those attending board meetings. It also established an independent review process for grievances and appeals. Most importantly, the revised bylaws clearly defined the limits of HOA authority and established procedures for challenging board actions that exceeded those limits. Never again would a small group of residents be able to hijack the community governance structure for their personal agenda. Patricia herself quietly sold her property and moved away from Harmony Estates within 6 months of the failed vote. Several of her closest allies followed suit, apparently preferring to find a community that better matched their vision of exclusive lakefront living. The lake returned to its original purpose as a recreational amenity for all residents. Children once again played freely in the water. Families enjoyed barbecues on the docks, and boats of all sizes shared the peaceful waters without restriction or harassment. Mark's boat remained proudly moored at his dock, a symbol of the successful fight against HOA overreach, and a reminder that community associations exist to serve all residents rather than the narrow interests of a privileged few. The Harmony Estates experience became a case study in HOA reform, and Mark found himself frequently consulted by other communities facing similar issues. His legal expertise, combined with his first-hand experience of HOA abuse, made him an effective advocate for homeowner rights. The lake itself thrived under proper environmental management. The state monitoring program ensured that water quality remained high and that the ecosystem was protected for future generations. The collaborative approach to lake management proved far more effective than Patricia's
heavy-handed restrictions.
Years later, Mark would often sit on his dock in the evening watching the sun set over Lake Harmony and reflecting on the importance of standing up to authority when it exceeds its proper bounds. His boat bobbed gently at the mooring, a testament to the principle that community associations must serve the common good rather than the personal preferences of those who seek to control them. The fight against Patricia's HOA overreach had required significant time, energy, and legal expertise, but the results had benefited every resident of Harmony Estates. Property values had actually increased once the uncertainty over lake access was resolved, and the community had developed a stronger sense of unity and shared purpose. Mark had learned that defeating HOA abuse required more than just legal knowledge. It required community organizing, careful documentation, and the courage to challenge authority even when the odds seemed stacked against individual homeowners. The experience had also taught him that many HOA problems stemmed from good people failing to stay engaged in community governance, leaving the field open for those with personal agendas. The reformed board continued to function effectively under the new bylaws, with decisions made transparently and with genuine input from all residents. Board meetings were well-intended and focused on legitimate community maintenance issues rather than personal preferences disguised as community standards. Lake Harmony remained a peaceful retreat where families could enjoy water recreation without fear of harassment or arbitrary restrictions. The dock accommodated boats of all sizes, and the water was once again filled with the sounds of children playing and families enjoying their lakefront investment. Mark continued to practice maritime law, but his experience with HOA overreach had given him new insight into the importance of community governance and property rights. He had successfully defended not just his own boat, but the rights of an entire community to enjoy the amenities they had purchased in good faith. The orange towing notice that had started the conflict remained framed in Mark's office as a reminder of how quickly community associations can exceed their authority when residents fail to stay vigilant. It served as inspiration for his continued advocacy work, helping other communities resist HOA overreach and preserve the rights that make homeownership meaningful. In the end, Patricia's attempt to control Lake Harmony had backfired completely. Instead of creating an exclusive enclave, she had triggered a community-wide awakening that strengthened resident rights and established lasting protections against future abuse. The lake she had tried to control now stood as a symbol of successful resistance to authoritarian community governance and a model for balanced HOA management that serves all residents equally.